You just returned from Tibet not too long ago. You're a guy that's been around the world, and you're not slowing down anytime soon that I can tell. But you just returned from Tibet. Tibet and China have been at odds with each other for a very long time, and I know you've got a lot of experience with the resistance in Tibet as well. What can you tell us about what's going on over there? What do Americans need to understand about what's going on between Tibet and China?
So I was on this most recent trip, I was in India on the border with Chinese occupied Tibet. Mm-hmm. So the situation with Tibet is actually incredibly similar to the situation between Ukraine and Russia, in the sense that Tibet historically has always been its own country with a distinct language, culture, history, ethnic identity. And China, the imperial aggressor next door, has for generations said, you have no right to exist. You belong to the motherland. And so in 1950, China invaded Tibet, took over, much like Russia has tried to invade Ukraine, except in the case of Tibet, Chinese were successful in taking over the whole country. They went on to carry out, a few years after the main invasion, around mid-1950s, they started committing horrible crimes within Tibet. They were forcing, nuns and monks to have sex with each other. They were eviscerating people. They were, just doing all these terrible things, like, beheading people in public squares, like just very medieval, barbaric, horrible things, a genocide by every measure. And that then spurred from within Tibetan society a grassroots resistance movement, originally by a group called the Chushi Gondruk, which then evolved into a National Volunteer Defense Army, they called themselves, but an insurgency ultimately supported by the CIA up until the early 1970s. That in the beginning, they scored some pretty significant victories against the Chinese, but as time went on, just by sheer virtue of mass, the Chinese were able to overcome the resistance. The greatest victory of the resistance was evacuating the Dalai Lama out of the Tibetan capital of Lhasa into India in 1959, which by evacuating their spiritual and at the time political leader out of the country, they were able to basically preserve the spirit of resistance, which endures to this day. So now the Dalai Lama and his government in exile, the Central Tibetan Administration, they live in Dharamshala, India. They have like a government in exile, a little enclave of Tibetan culture, and in theory, a government that could go back and replace the Chinese regime one day. And I've gone there to Dharamshala quite a few times, about once a year for like the last decade, to interact both with veterans of the Tibetan resistance from the Cold War, but also the next generation of Tibetans who want to carry on the future of that resistance. On this past trip, I was in the Indian region of Ladakh, which is a Himalayan region on the border with Tibet, which is now occupied obviously by China. And it's a very like austere Himalayan environment, very similar to Afghanistan, like kind of like orange, reddish mountains with hardly any vegetation, not even that much snow, even though the mountains are up consistently above 20,000 feet. Incredibly harsh environment. But Ladakh is traditionally Tibetan territory. And out there, there are Indian units on the border with China, because that border region is contentious, right? I mean, I think we did some stories at Coffee or Die about there were like border battles where it's like Anchorman Ron Burgundy fights with like billy clubs and hatchets and stuff, very, very crazy things. But in the 1960s, while the CIA stood up this Tibetan resistance in 1962, there was a war between India and China invaded some Indian territory in the mountains, and India desperately needed a mountain warfare unit. So with the CIA's help, they created a unit called Establishment 22, which drew recruits from this Tibetan refugee population within India. And the Tibetans are obviously, they're famous for being genetically capable at functioning at high altitude in ways that
famously
most humans can't, right? Like, and I've seen it in action, like where they're running circles around me and I'm just like, like dying out there because they're just blood just carries more oxygen or whatever. Very effective at high altitude. And so anyway, India created this crack unit of basically an SF unit. Their original intent was to be able to go into Tibet and organize an insurgency. And they've since evolved into something maybe closer to like a ranger unit where, just
more of like a direct action raiding sort of force rather than a go in and organize resistances.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what they are now. Although I think there's still elements of it's a little bit of like a finger wagging to China that don't try anything because we could insert this force into Tibet and cause some serious problems for you. But on that contested border, they have special frontier force units still out there, although they keep the Tibetans back from the front line because they know that Tibetans' hatred for China is so intense that if you put them right there within like eyeball to eyeball distance of the Chinese, you might have some problems.
Yeah.
So they keep them back, but they're kind of like a QRF sort of function force that if there was any Chinese incursion or any open fighting on that Himalayan border, these Tibetan units are available to attack. And also, India has used a special frontier force in combat with Pakistan numerous times because they also have a Himalayan border. But as we look ahead, so you have this Tibetan resistance. So in the 1970s, mid 1970s, the violent resistance ended. The CIA stopped support. I think it was 1972, about the same time Nixon normalized relations with China. And then the resistance, which was by then based in the Mustang region of Nepal, it kind of fizzled out. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the Dalai Lama implored these guerrilla fighters to lay down their arms. And since then, the Dalai Lama has very strictly advocated for nonviolent resistance. However, within the Tibetan community, both in exile and within Tibet, there is still a subset of Tibetans who believe that freedom could be possible and that violent resistance could be an option. Mm-hmm. If there's a realistic chance of success. And what are the factors of a realistic chance of success? An economic meltdown in China and possibly a war over Taiwan.
So they're just waiting for conditions to be right before
some sort of force majeure that could open up. And their idea, though, is so 60% of China's landmass comprises these captive nations: East Turkestan, Tibet, Manchuria, Southern Mongolia. And the idea being that if Tibetans were to have a major revolt, maybe in East Turkestan, the Uyghurs would rise up. And you have sort of a Arab Spring-like scenario within China.
And they certainly would like to, after being subjected to slavery.
Absolutely.
Or like modern slavery, like literal modern slavery.
Yes. And you see in Tibet, as in East Turkestan, like this Orwellian Gestapo state where, it's like out of a dystopian novel, the way that
China's done a good job of incentivizing some of these ethnic minorities within their current borders to be just absolutely salivating at the idea of trouble being caused out in Taiwan so that they could strike and
absolutely
get their moment to become sovereign again and not be subjected to the whims of a communist People's Republic of China.
Absolutely. And so you have the Tibetan cause is often misunderstood as this Richard Gere does great work, but they associate Tibetans with Richard Gere, the actor.
I didn't even know about that.
Oh yeah, and I'm a huge supporter of that because he does great work. But they misunderstand the Tibetans as like this Buddhist, New Age thing, forgetting that the Khampa warriors from Tibet are some of the fierce, they're historically very fierce warriors, and so the question is now, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, just turned 90 years old, and he has always been this governing force on this latent, simmering desire for a more aggressive resistance within the Tibetan community. And when he passes away, what happens? Is it a volcano that erupts once that corking pressure is relieved? Does the resistance fade away now that it lacks its symbolic leader? And that's a big question within the Tibetan community. Like there is debate now, and there's a question about which direction do we take this. Also, the Dalai Lama, since the mid-1980s, has advocated for a policy called the Middle Way, which does not he's not advocating for full independence for Tibet any longer. He says it's a status called genuine autonomy, wherein the Tibetans will have, it's basically like overlordship from the Chinese, where Tibetans can kind of control their internal environment, but issues of state are controlled by the Chinese.
What would be the more accurate comparison, like a Kurdistan within Iraq, or like an India under Great Britain? Like what kind of autonomy
I would say like
are
more
they advocating
Kurdistan under Iraq.
Yeah.
Is because it's still like you still have like a Chinese passport, right? Like and direct control by the state too. You're not divorced by distance. There's gonna be roads. You're gonna have military units based there and all these things. So like that's, I think Kurdistan under Iraq would be a more apt example. I guess you could say like Puerto Rico in the United States or something, but we're not taking that by force. Yeah. But like, a region that has like some sort of autonomy, but still falls under the purview.
I'm laughing because Puerto Rico is like the exact opposite. They're like, can we please become a state?
Exactly.
Like, please, what do we got to do over here to get statehood?
There's a major breakdown in that analogy. That I'd be clear to highlight. So I don't get skewered on the internet. But yeah, but I think the point being is there is a fork in the road for the Tibetan cause coming up, both, when His Holiness passes away, and there's going to be a succession battle over that for sure. China will choose its new Dalai Lama. The Tibetans will choose their own. That could ignite protest. In 2008, by the way, there was massive protest in Tibet that bordered on achieving, I think, something you could call like a revolt within the country. And that precipitated, since 2008, a huge crackdown on security within Tibet by the Chinese. But within the Tibetan community, I think I bring up the Special Frontier Force because I guess one metric or barometer that I look at is to measure whether there is a latent desire to fight within the Tibetan community is the fact that you have young Tibetan men in India still in large amounts volunteering to serve within this Indian commando unit specifically for the chance to kill Chinese or to fight the Chinese in their lifetime. It's a small chance they know, but that's what draws them in to this unit.
When I think about this, so my takeaway as an American looking at this through an American lens is, okay, tensions over Taiwan have continued to escalate. And when we think about that, we think, wow, gosh, getting involved. Do we really need Taiwan? Oh, I guess we do need semiconductor independence. And because China, getting into a war with China, that's, over on kind of like their side of the world seems difficult. But then when you sort of this sort of complicates that when you think about like, okay, if Taiwan kicked off, and I don't for a second believe that the CIA and the special forces community are not thinking and salivating over the idea of just spawning uprisals all over Western and Southern China. I hope they are. Yeah, because that would seem like the way to do that is like, okay, we would have to, in order to keep bloodshed to a minimum and sort of tamp Chinese military ability and distract, even if possible, them losing half or 2/3 of their country really to these things by popular uprisings happening. Like Americans know, the CIA knows how to start a popular uprising, right? Like they know how to do that. And so that's something I just think, again, thinking out loud here, I don't have any special access to information or anything like that. Maybe this is already being planned for, maybe it's not. I don't know. But the way I look at that is like maybe conflict between China and Taiwan and U.S. involvement is not a foregone conclusion of a large world war. Maybe it's something that doesn't quite escalate to that right off the bat because of the fact that China would potentially be compromised at the same time. And by the way, they also, correct me if I'm wrong here, they depend on that part of their country and a lot of these ethnic minorities as conscripts for a potential war, like with a large nation state, but a large superpower like the United States. They would need conscripts.
I don't know how. I think the Tibetan population is relatively small.
I'm talking about all the ethnic minorities out there.
I think, that and the Chinese are definitely trying to recruit Tibetans actually to serve on the border with India, thinking they can have Tibetans versus Tibetans out there. But yes, so to your point, I'm not trying to be Nolan of Tibet here, trying to right over the Himalayas.
It's just interesting because we don't talk about this. It's a part of the world. I would guess most people couldn't find Tibet on a map, an unlabeled map, right?
But I think it's like what I frequently think about though is that China is doing a lot to subvert our country. Like they have no qualms about sending fentanyl across our borders, trying to diminish and destabilize us from within. We need to return the favor. And it doesn't mean sponsoring a Tibetan uprising. I'm not advocating that. And I would fear that if we ever did something like that, it would end up like what happened to the Kurds, where we ignite a country's hope for freedom and then let them hang on the vine in the end. So, but I think a way to humiliate China on the world stage, a way to possibly improve the condition of Tibetans living under this horrible Gestapo state inside occupied Tibet, is to highlight what China's doing, to embarrass them, to say like, okay, you want to be taken seriously on the world stage? You want to be a great power? Why are you forcing Tibetan women to marry Chinese men to breed them out of existence? That's not something a great power does. Mm-hmm. Like that cruelty, that barbarity by which they are trying to suppress the Tibetan desire for freedom and Tibetan national identity is something that should humiliate China on the world stage. And that is an opportunity for the United States to diminish China, hopefully divert their internal attention, because we know when the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949, they had 3 goals in 1949: to take control of Hainan, Tibet, and Taiwan. They got 2 out of 3, right? Taiwan is like the remaining question, but Tibet and Taiwan were on the same level of importance. They see it as an existential need for them to achieve civilizational greatness. And if we inject any instability into that, any uncertainty into that, that could greatly diminish their appetite for engaging in some military adventure over Taiwan if they feel like one of the 3 pillars of their national existence is under attack from within. An attack, I mean, just by legitimacy. So, yeah, I think that we need to, if China is like to empower the Tibetans to advocate for more autonomy, to highlight the injustices done to them, to help amplify their message. Some would say, well, we got to worry about China, like seeing that as some like existential threat to them. They're going to escalate. Well, they're already doing it to us. They're doing it in spades to us. They're doing it so much more maliciously to us. They're killing Americans with these fentanyl shipments. Like, why do we chain ourselves to some standard of like reluctance of interfering with them when they do it so much more to us? And they assume we're doing it anyway, so let's just live up to our bad reputation and do it, right? But but do it in a way that we are consistent with our national values, which is we have a nation that has every right to exist as a sovereign, independent nation, and moreover, a national identity, which China is trying to eradicate, much like the Russians are trying to eradicate the Ukrainian nationality. And it's certainly in line with our national values to stand by a country and say, okay, like we may not be in a position to like try and get your statehood back, but we can certainly do everything we can to prevent China from eradicating your nation from the earth.